Barry Holden wanted the corner booth, and Lawrence Dumont, halfway through his eggs and toast, told him no. Holden called it obstruction, grabbed him by the collar, and walked him out in front of 32 customers, smiling the way a man smiles when he knows no one in the room is going to argue with him. Nobody in Pinecrest did. What Holden didn't know was that the man whose jacket he'd just grabbed had been sworn in as Commissioner of the Ontario Provincial Police 9 days earlier and had driven 4 hours north in the dark to investigate him. Then 2 black SUVs came off the highway onto Main Street. Lawrence Dumont had taken Highway 11 out of Toronto at 4:30 in the morning, before the city woke up, before anyone at the office could spot him in the parking structure and ask where he was headed. He drove a gray Subaru with a cracked rear mud flap and a coffee stain on the passenger seat that had been there since February. He wore a Carhartt jacket, dark jeans, and work boots that had been resoled once. He carried no badge, no sidearm, and no identification beyond his driver's license and a health card from the same wallet he'd used for 11 years. His name was Lawrence Dumont, and 9 days earlier, in a ceremony with 17 people in a room that held 40, he had been sworn in as Commissioner of the Ontario Provincial Police. He had been a widower for 3 years, long enough that the fact had stopped being something he mentioned and started being something he simply carried, like the worn crease in the collar of the jacket he still wore because his wife had given it to him. Nobody upstairs had liked the idea of him driving himself. His deputy had spent most of a Tuesday morning listing reasons, most of them reasonable, all of them beside the point. The protocols existed. There were field units. There were proper channels for exactly this kind of preliminary review. Lawrence had listened to all of it from a chair in a boardroom with Venetian blinds that someone had bent at the bottom, and then said that the files from Pinecrest didn't read like something you understood from a distance. They settled it with 2 conditions. He would call in on the hour without fail, and 2 officers from the Barrie detachment would sit at a motel 43 kilometers south on the highway, close enough to reach him, far enough that no one in Pinecrest would notice provincial plates parked overnight. Lawrence had agreed to both in the manner of a man agreeing to things he intends never to need. He stopped at the town limit sign at 10 minutes to 7 to make the first call. 9 seconds. Location status intention. He hung up and sat with the engine idling. Outside, the morning was flat and cold in the way northern Ontario mornings are cold even in late May, not sharp, just settled into the ground. The trees were mostly spruce and they went on for a long time in every direction. Pinecrest hadn't quite decided what it was. A mill had closed in the late 90s and a handful of the buildings on the main street still showed it, vacant windows, hand-lettered for lease signs that had lost whatever color they'd started with. But there was a new recreation center at the south end, and the diner had been redone sometime recently, clapboard replaced with dark green slats that looked like someone had actually thought about it. 2 patrol vehicles sat outside the municipal hall. In a town of 3,800 people, Lawrence counted them twice. He'd found Pinecrest the ordinary way, through paperwork that shouldn't have been ordinary at all. 41 complaints over 16 years, filed with the town, the county, and twice with the provincial ombudsman's office. None had been formally investigated. None had produced a hearing. An analyst in the Civil Oversight Division had flagged the file 6 months back with a single word in the margin, pattern. The complaints described seizures without receipts, holds without charges, and a concentration of traffic stops along the same stretch of County Road 12 that fell almost entirely on the same demographic of license plate: out of province, indigenous, and young. Every complaint in the folder ended at the same name. Chief Barry Holden had run the Pinecrest Police Service for 18 years. Before that, he had worn a constable's uniform under the chief, who hired him out of his hometown 80 kilometers east, where his father had once sat on the town council. Lawrence parked beside the diner at 7:15 and sat in the car for 2 minutes before going in. Through the window, he could see a counter with stools, 4 booths along the far wall, and a woman in an apron moving between tables with a coffee pot held at her hip. The lot was mostly full, mostly trucks. 1 minivan with a booster seat visible through the rear window. The bell above the door rang when he pushed it open. A few heads turned, registered nothing in particular, and turned back. The woman with the coffee pot glanced up from the register. Her name tag read Bev Norris. Mid-50s, efficient, with the settled ease of someone who has read a room from the same spot for a long time. She told him to sit anywhere. Lawrence took the corner booth along the window, the one facing the door, and across the street, the low brick building with the municipal crest above the entrance that he'd already identified as the police station. Bev brought the coffee before he asked. Lawrence ordered eggs over easy, brown toast, no butter. He told her he wasn't in any hurry. She wrote it without looking at the pad and said, coming right up in a tone that was warm without being performed, and he read in how she moved back toward the kitchen that she'd already decided he was passing through on his way somewhere. That was exactly what he wanted her to think. The room settled. Two men in work jackets at the counter debated whether the repaving on Cedar Mill Road would hold through the first freeze. A woman at the far booth turned pages in a magazine with a mug in her other hand. The radio in the kitchen came in slightly off station. Lawrence ate half his toast and allowed himself the thought that he might spend 3 quiet days here and leave with nothing more than notes and a confirmed sense of unease. At 7:20, the bell above the door rang again. The room didn't go quiet. It dropped the way the volume in a space drops when someone enters who changes the air without having to try. 2 men at the counter found things to study in their coffees. The woman with the magazine set it face down on the table. Lawrence kept his eyes on his plate and used the window glass, which gave him a clean reflection of the entrance. Barry Holden came in first, hat on indoors, wide through the shoulders, in full uniform with the chief's insignia worn the way a man wears something he stopped noticing years ago. Behind him on the left, a sergeant named Blackwell went straight to the counter and helped himself to a mug without asking anyone. On the right, a constable, late 20s, body camera on her chest, standing with a stillness that sometimes means inexperience and sometimes means something else entirely. Her name tape read Correa. She was the only one of the 3 whose camera was switched on. Holden worked the room on the way in, a hand on a shoulder here. A first name called across the floor there, an inquiry about someone's daughter with an actual pause to hear the answer. It was practiced and it was entirely genuine, and Lawrence understood immediately why 16 years of complaints had never produced a single formal review. The man wasn't resented. He was liked. That was the more difficult problem. Then Holden reached the middle of the floor and stopped. There was a stranger in the corner booth. Lawrence watched Bev's hand close around the coffee pot before she turned toward the kitchen pass-through and put her back to the room. That single movement told him more about Pinecrest than the complaints folder had. Blackwell set his mug down. Correa's camera light stayed steady. Holden crossed to the booth without hurrying. He stood at the edge of the table close enough that his belt buckle was at Lawrence's eye level. He looked down with an expression that was almost agreeable. He said good morning and noted that this particular booth was his, that it had been every morning for a long time, that anyone in the room could confirm it, and that he would appreciate it if the gentleman moved to the counter. The room had gone fully quiet. A fork touched a plate somewhere and the sound carried. Lawrence looked up at him and did not move. He said, evenly, that he had come in at 7:15, that the waitress had shown him to a seat, and that his breakfast was already in front of him. He said it without heat, without emphasis on any particular word, like a man reading the time off a clock. Holden's expression didn't shift, but his weight did. He said he wasn't sure the gentleman understood how things worked in Pinecrest. Lawrence said he understood how a restaurant worked. He said the booth hadn't been reserved, that there was no sign to that effect, that every customer who came through the door had the same claim on it, and that if the chief wanted the seat tomorrow, he was welcome to arrive earlier. Behind the counter, Bev closed her eyes. Blackwell laughed once, short, disbelieving, and stopped when no one joined him. Holden stood very still. In 18 years of walking into that room, no one had said no to him in public. He had never needed them to. Lawrence watched him in the window glass and understood that Holden wasn't angry yet. He was calculating what it would cost him to be turned down in front of these people and finding the number unacceptable. "On your feet," Holden said. Lawrence asked quietly on what grounds. That was the sentence that ended it, not the refusal, the question. Holden turned to the room before he spoke, which was the tell. A man acting within the law does not check his audience first. He said, loud enough to carry through the glass, that a man had been sitting where he could observe the front of the police station since he arrived, that a man who twice refused a lawful directive in public was communicating something about himself, and that he had no way of knowing what brought a stranger like this to his town. He said obstruction, then he said it again. The second time, he had already made it real in his own mind. Lawrence set his fork flat on the plate and put both hands on the table where everyone could see them. He said clearly enough that 32 people would repeat the sentence later, almost word for word, that he was not refusing to identify himself, that his wallet was in his left jacket pocket, and that he was not armed. Holden told him to stand up and turn around. Lawrence stood. He turned. He put his hands behind his back without being told, which was the one thing he hadn't intended, a reflex built up across too many years on the other side of that same position, faster than his judgment. The cuffs went on his left wrist and then his right. Holden ratcheted them one notch tighter than necessary, the way a man does when he is making a point rather than securing a prisoner. Nobody in the diner moved, 32 people, and not one said a word. Lawrence stood facing the window with his own reflection in it and took inventory of the room behind him. The two men at the counter with their eyes in their mugs, the woman with the magazine face down in her lap, Bev at the pass-through window, dish towel folded over her arm, jaw set. Every one of them had run the same arithmetic and arrived at the same answer, that a stranger's bad morning was a cheaper cost than 18 years of consequences. Near the counter, one of the men in work jackets had his phone low against his leg, screen lit, held at an angle only someone watching for it would catch. It stayed there for perhaps 15 seconds. Then he looked up, met Blackwell's eye, and the phone disappeared into his jacket pocket. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and didn't move again. Correa took a step toward the booth. "Chief," she said, "nothing more than that." Holden didn't look at her. He said she could get the door. Correa stood there while the clock on the wall ticked twice. Lawrence watched her in the window glass. He saw the exact moment she made her decision, and he saw also that the light on her camera had not gone out. She went and got the door. Blackwell took Lawrence by the upper arm and walked him outside. Holden picked up the half-finished plate from the table, looked at it once, and set it on the counter in front of Bev. Then he sat down in the corner booth. He was already settled when they walked Lawrence past him toward the door, and he did not once look at the man in handcuffs. At no point did Lawrence Dumont say who he was. He could have ended the whole thing in a sentence. His name, his title, the detachment number. The color would have left Holden's face right there between the register and the coat hooks. Everything that followed would never have happened. Every instinct built across 13 years in federal oversight told him to say it now. A commissioner in handcuffs in a small-town diner was not a situation that ended quietly. But there had been 41 complaints, and every one of the people who had written them had stood in exactly this position, without a title to say out loud, without a provincial crest behind them, without anyone 43 kilometers away waiting for a reason to move. He had said it to his deputy in a Toronto boardroom, not yet understanding it the way he understood it now, standing against a cold patrol car in a diner parking lot in northern Ontario. The files written by people who have never been on the wrong end of this tend to read very calmly. He let Blackwell walk him out. He let the bell above the door ring behind him. The parking lot had an audience before the door finished closing. People came to the diner windows the way they come when something is happening to somebody else. Close enough to see, far enough back that no one outside could say for certain who was watching. A man beside a pickup with a travel mug in his hand. Across the street, a woman with keys frozen at a door she hadn't finished unlocking. Blackwell stood Lawrence against the rear door of the cruiser and let go of his arm. He put his thumbs in his belt with the satisfied posture of a man standing next to something he's finished building. Holden came out last. He put his hat on at the threshold, adjusted it once, and surveyed the lot with visible ease. He addressed no one in particular, which meant he was addressing everyone. He said a man had been sitting where he could monitor the station's entrance for over half an hour. He said in 18 years he'd learned to pay attention to that kind of thing. He said Pinecrest's safety was not something he was going to apologize for keeping. Nobody contradicted him. That was the whole of it. Lawrence stood with his shoulders against cold metal and counted. 26 people within earshot. The man with the travel mug. The woman at the tax office across the street, still frozen at her door. Bev, who had come as far as the diner entrance and stopped there with the dish towel still over her arm, and who was the only person in Pinecrest looking directly at him. None of them said a word. He was not angry with them. He had expected to be. But a stranger costs you nothing, and a chief who has been writing the rules for 18 years costs you everything, for as long as you intend to keep living in the same town. 18 years is long enough to teach a community to run that calculation without noticing it's running. Correa came out behind Holden and stood by the front bumper of the first cruiser. She had not touched Lawrence once. She kept glancing at him, and then at the middle distance, the way someone looks when they've committed to a decision they're still deciding whether to stand behind. The light on her camera was still on. Blackwell noticed. He told her she was draining her battery on a trespassing dispute. Correa said she kept the camera running during any transport involving custody. She said it the way a person says a rule they've learned well enough to repeat it under pressure, because it was the only ground she had left to stand on. Holden turned around at that. He looked at her for a moment, not unkindly, more the way someone looks at a new hire who has spoken at the wrong time, and said that when she had 18 years on the job, she could decide what needed recording. He said it warmly. A couple of people in the lot smiled. The camera light stayed on. Correa didn't switch it off and didn't look at her chief again, and Lawrence filed that away with everything else. At 8 o'clock exactly, the phone in his jacket pocket began to ring. It rang against his ribs, muffled, 4 times. Stopped. Blackwell said something about popular guys. Holden didn't react. He was in the middle of a story about a call on the county road the previous summer, and the phone was simply part of the noise of a morning going well for him. It rang a second time 40 seconds later, then a third. Nobody reached for it. Nobody searched for it. Nobody asked about it at all. Lawrence stood against the patrol car and let it ring. For the first time since the cuffs had closed, something shifted in his expression. Not fear. Something far more expensive for Barry Holden, which was patience. 43 kilometers south on Highway 11, 2 OPP officers listened to a call go to voicemail 3 times, checked a location ping that hadn't moved from a diner parking lot in 14 minutes, and stopped waiting. They were moving in 90 seconds. The duty officer at the Barry detachment had a second unit behind them before the first had cleared the on-ramp. Holden finished his story, opened the rear door of the cruiser, put one hand flat on the roof, and told Lawrence to watch his head. They came from the north end of Main Street at 8:42, and the sound arrived before the vehicles did. 2 of them, black, moving with a pace that said something without saying it. The lead SUV turned into the diner lot and stopped at an angle that closed the entrance. The second stopped across the street with its nose out and its engine running. Doors opened at once. 5 officers stepped out. Every one of them had credentials on a chain and a jacket with 3 letters across the back in yellow, OPP. The lot went quiet in the space of a breath. The man with the travel mug set it on the hood of his truck. Blackwell's hand moved toward his belt and stopped halfway. Correa took 2 careful steps back and put her hands out from her sidesets, palms open, visible, the most professionally correct thing anyone in a Pinecrest Police Service uniform did that entire morning. A woman came around the front of the lead SUV, early 50s, dark suit beneath the jacket, moving with the economy of someone who doesn't waste steps. Inspector Louise Hebert. She scanned the lot in one pass, didn't stop on the crowd. Her eyes landed on Lawrence. "Commissioner Dumont," she said. "Are you injured?" Lawrence said he was not. Behind her, Senior Constable Brian Norwood came forward with his credentials already open. A broad man with close-cropped gray hair. And he didn't address Holden at all. He addressed the lot. He held the credentials up and turned slowly so that the diner windows, the people at the trucks, and both officers in Pinecrest uniforms could see the photograph and the provincial seal. "This is Lawrence Dumont," Norwood said. "Commissioner of the Ontario Provincial Police, sworn into office 9 days ago. He is here under provincial authority. As of right now, this is a provincial scene." The sound that moved through the parking lot wasn't a gasp. It was smaller and more particular than that. It was 30 people arriving at the same understanding in the same second, and none of them willing to be the first to name it out loud. Bev's hand came up over her mouth. Barry Holden did not move. His arm was still half raised from where he'd been gesturing through a story. The color drained from his face slowly, from the top down, like water leaving a glass. Then he laughed, a short, empty sound with nothing behind it, and said that wasn't possible. Hebert said it was. Holden said the man had no identification, he'd asked. Lawrence spoke then, for the first time since the diner door had closed behind him, and he did not raise his voice. He said, "I told you where my wallet was. You didn't look. There are 32 people inside that building who heard me say it." Holden's mouth opened. Nothing came out of it. Blackwell had gone the color of old ash. He was looking at his own hand, the one that had been on the commissioner's arm. The way someone looks at something they've just understood cannot be taken back. Hebert held out her hand for the key. Lawrence said not yet. Hebert stopped. He said the cuffs stayed on until the scene was properly documented. He wanted photographs from every angle, every vehicle's position on record, the name of every person present, written down while they were still present, and he wanted all of it done with the restraints exactly where Chief Holden had put them. He said that people had been filing complaints in this town for 16 years, and that the only difference between him and the 41 people who had written those complaints was that his phone was already ringing when he needed it. He said the record was going to show what it actually looked like. It stayed on for 9 minutes. The commissioner of the Ontario Provincial Police stood in a diner parking lot in handcuffs while officers photographed him from every angle, and Barry Holden stood 6 feet away and was made to watch all of it. Then it came apart quickly. 2 officers crossed to the municipal police station and served a provincial oversight notice on the duty clerk before she had finished getting to her feet. The external camera above the station entrance came off its mount within the hour and went into an evidence bag. The diner's interior camera came down with Bev's written consent. She signed it standing against the front counter before the officer had finished explaining what he was asking for. At 9:20 from inside his own station, Holden filed a supplemental narrative describing a subject who had been verbally combative and refused repeated requests to identify himself. 32 people had watched that not happen. He filed it while 5 provincial officers stood 40 feet from his window. System access was suspended at 9:55. Dispatch records, arrest reports, evidence inventories, tow releases, and property seizure records going back 18 years went under provincial seal before noon. The supplemental narrative went with them, time-stamped, uneditable, 21 minutes old. Blackwell surrendered his body camera. It contained 4 minutes of footage for the entire shift, which became a document all by itself. Correa handed hers over without being asked. She unclipped it herself, stated the serial number aloud before she passed it across, and Norwood wrote something in his notebook before taking it from her. The man in the work jacket who had been sitting at the counter, a contractor named Jim Saulnier, born and raised in Pinecrest, waited until the lot had thinned and then came to Hebert with his phone held out in both hands. 22 seconds of video. Holden crossing the diner floor. Lawrence's hands flat on the table. The word obstruction, used twice in 30 seconds. Saulnier said he'd put the phone away because Blackwell had looked at him, and that he'd sat in his truck for 40 minutes afterward, trying to decide whether to come over. Hebert took the phone and told him he was the first person from inside the building to come forward. Then the thing nobody had planned began. Stephen Larocque was 53 years old and ran a firewood delivery business off the same property on County Road 12, where his family had worked for 2 decades. He had been stopped on that road 11 times in 2 years. 6 of those stops had included a search of his truck bed. Equipment had been taken in 2 of them, and had never appeared on any inventory, in any record, in any building in Pinecrest. He walked up to Norwood with his hands in his jacket pockets and said he hadn't told anyone for 4 years because he hadn't believed anyone was listening. After Larocque, a woman who had been pulled over 5 times in a single month. After her, a man who had been spoken to on a dark stretch of the county road about what would happen to his contracting licenses if he kept raising questions about a seized trailer. By noon, there were 14 people standing in a room at the Civic Center that Hebert had opened, because the line outside the municipal building had become visible from the main intersection. 16 years of quiet arithmetic, and the whole town was doing the math out loud at once. The records did not require interpretation, which is the particular tragedy of men like Barry Holden. They believe the danger lies in what people say. It is almost always in what they wrote down. 11 property seizure records listed items in the intake column that did not appear in the disposition column. 7 arrests across 9 years had no corresponding notification to the Crown Attorney's Office, including 1 individual held for 31 hours with no charge and no counsel. 4 incident reports carried timestamps that didn't align with the call logs they referenced. Holden made his calls from the sidewalk outside his station. The mayor listened for 2 minutes before saying he'd need to consult legal counsel. The regional solicitor didn't answer. He stood on the pavement with the phone at his side, his hat in his other hand, and didn't dial a 3rd number because there wasn't one left. At 4:15, in front of the station he had run for 18 years, Holden was served with a formal notice of suspension by the town's deputy administrator. He surrendered his service weapon and his commission card. He unpinned his badge from his uniform himself because no one had told him to yet, and he understood the moment well enough to know that it was time. He set it on the hood of the cruiser that had been his for 6 years. The sound it made on the metal was very small. Norwood advised him of his rights on the sidewalk in front of the station. Jim Saulnier was still there to hear it. So was Bev, who had closed the diner at 1 in the afternoon and had been sitting in the corner booth since then with the lights off, in the quiet of a room that smelled like coffee and bacon grease, and a morning she was going to be thinking about for a long time. She gave the statement that ran 11 pages. Most of it was about mornings, about 18 years of watching the room drop every time the bell above the door rang, about the plate she'd cleared from the corner booth that day and the half-finished eggs she hadn't known what to do with. Lawrence flew back to Toronto that evening because a commissioner cannot run a field investigation and should not try. Hebert stayed. The case was formally consolidated with the Provincial Special Prosecution's Office within the week. Charging documents came down 12 days after the arrest: deprivation of rights under color of law, falsification of records, and related offenses. Blackwell was named in 3 counts. He submitted a resignation letter the day before he was served, which changed neither the charges nor his exposure to them. The county council appointed an acting chief 9 days after the arrest. They gave the position to Maya Correa, who had 4 years on the department and who had been the only person in a Pinecrest Police Service uniform that morning, with a camera running and her hands where anyone could see them. She hadn't wanted the job. She said so on the record at the council meeting. She told them she had taken 1 step toward that booth and then gone and gotten the door instead, and that a person who had done that had no business being handed a department. Norwood had asked to sit in on the appointment and said the only thing worth saying. He told the council that across the 18 years Barry Holden had run that building, Maya Correa was the only person inside it who had ever left a light on. The reforms were not dramatic and they were not fast. Body cameras went to continuous recording on every contact, uploading to a county server that no one inside the department could access. Arrest reports locked at filing, with amendments visible as amendments. Every custodial hold went to the Crown's office within 6 hours, or the person walked. A civilian review board was seated with 5 residents on it. Stephen Larocque was one of the 5. Nobody in the room found that surprising, and everybody found it right. None of it was new. All of it had existed on paper somewhere in that brick building before. It had simply never been enforced by anyone who could be told no. What actually changed in Pinecrest was smaller and harder to write into a policy. People started talking. The line at the Civic Center ran for 8 days. By the end, there were 53 statements on file, and 40 of them described incidents more than 3 years old, which meant that for 3 years, 53 people had been carrying the same story, each one believing they were the only person holding it. Lawrence came back to Pinecrest on a Thursday 14 days after the morning he'd arrived. He drove the same Subaru with the cracked mud flap. He stopped at the town limit sign and made a call that lasted 9 seconds. He wore the same jacket. Hebert had mentioned a suit and he'd said no, and she had understood why before he finished saying it. The lot was just over half full. The morning was overcast, the spruce trees on the east side of town unchanged and patient. The bell above the door rang when he pushed it open. Every head in the diner came up at once. It wasn't the same as the first morning, when a stranger had walked in and no one had bothered to look twice. This time the whole room stilled, nobody moving, nobody certain what the right thing was to do with the moment. Then Jim Saulnier at the counter with a coffee in front of him, set both palms flat on the surface and got to his feet. Bev stood next, then the two men from the counter, then the woman who had set her magazine face down 2 weeks ago. Then the rest in ones and twos until no one in the diner was sitting down except a small child in a booster seat near the back wall, who looked around at the adults with calm, untroubled curiosity. Nobody said his title, nobody said commissioner. They stood the way people stand when language has run out, and standing is the only thing left that carries any weight. And Lawrence understood exactly what it was, because it was not for the office he held. It was for 9 minutes in a parking lot with his hands behind his back and nobody coming for him. And for everyone else in that county who had stood in the same place and never had anyone come at all. He nodded once to the room and went and sat in the corner booth. Bev brought the coffee before he asked. Her hand was not entirely steady. She stood at the edge of the table with the pot and told him she had been standing 4 feet from that booth, with that same coffee pot in her hand on the morning it happened, and that she thought about it every single morning now. She said it the way people say things when they've decided it has to be said out loud before anything else can move. He told her the diner's camera footage was in the case file, that she'd signed the consent form before the officer had finished asking, that she had done more that morning than most of the people in the room. Bev went back to the kitchen and did not come out for a while. He ate the whole breakfast. Through the window, the brick building across the street had a notice board out front now, and the external camera had been replaced with a newer unit mounted at a different angle, covering more of the street. An acting chief was working a desk in there who had not wanted the job and was doing it anyway, which is sometimes the only way the right things get done. At 10 minutes to 8, Maya Correa came out the station's front door, saw the Subaru in the lot, and looked across at the window. Lawrence raised 2 fingers off the tabletop. Correa nodded and went to her vehicle. He paid at the register. He left the tip in cash under the edge of the plate, as he always did, and he made no speech, and nobody asked him for one. The bell rang once more behind him as he went out. The Subaru pulled onto Main Street heading south, and Pinecrest went back to its morning, and the diner filled up the way it always filled up, and after about 10 minutes the corner booth sat empty, and a woman who had come in at 6:45 and hadn't known where to sit decided to take it. There was no sign saying she couldn't.